Hello, I'm really pleased to be making this video because it comes from some ideas brought up by my Middleset students in Year 11. Um, Now, I try to teach them just like a top set. I do that with all my videos. I try to show you how to get the top marks and hopefully explain it in a way that you can understand it. But what so excited me this week was that one of my boys who said, "Don't name me, sir," but he knows who he is and is actually spectacularly lazy in class, suddenly came up with this fantastic analysis that I'm going to share with you. So we're going to look at the sleepwalking scene in Lady Macbeth, and the conventional view is that it's her guilt at her involvement with the killing of Duncan that has slowly sent her mad, and this is the cause of her suicide, the guilt at what she's become. It's also traditional to see it as Shakespeare having a little bit of a cop out, if you like, um, attacking women. So this shows her weakness. She's not really able to uh, show courage like her husband. Um, and he even executes her, if you like, off stage. She doesn't even die on stage, to show what a disgraceful woman she is. And so she's punished for acting not like a stereotypical woman, breaking society's convention. And the conventional view is Shakespeare's attacking her for this, and so she is sent to hell and punished for all eternity. So it's quite easy to see this. If I Google images of Lady Macbeth, you can see that most of them have two features. One, she's surrounded in darkness to suggest her evil, um, often covered in blood. And two, she's in quite a few poses which are either designed to look like a witch, as you can see here, um, or seductive, as though she has used her sexual attraction. Um, there's more of them on the other side of the page, actually. Anyway, used her sexual attraction to goad Macbeth into killing Duncan, and that's a particularly graphic image of that idea. Well, my students ask themselves this question: if Shakespeare's society is a patriarchal society, one run by men for their own interests to preserve their own power, and therefore denying women power, what would the psychological effect of that be? And they've started to come up with an interpretation that says it's not so much her guilt that leads her to commit suicide, it's the fact that she has no power in this society. She's tried to get this power through becoming queen, but ultimately, when she becomes queen, she finds that Macbeth gives her even less power than she had before. When they first started with this plan, Macbeth had written to her and called her my dearest partner in greatness. You know, he was promising equality, equal power in this patriarchal society. In other words, he was changing the patriarchy. But now, once she's become queen, he has reneged, gone back on this promise. So let's go back to this scene and re-examine it from that point of view. So firstly, we have a doctor and a waiting gentlewoman. Now, the waiting gentlewoman would have been the daughter probably of another thane. So she's not like a servant. She is someone of noble birth who's there to look after her queen. Now, the doctor says, "I have 2 nights watched with you." So they've been looking every night to see evidence of the sleepwalking. And why is the doctor there? Well, it seems from this line, your report, that it's the waiting woman, the gentlewoman, who has summoned the doctor. Now, this is a sign of great love for Lady Macbeth, and that doesn't fit with our traditional interpretation of her being entirely evil. So contrast that, if you will, with the way people behave towards her husband, towards Macbeth. They have no respect for him at this stage, and they only support him out of fear. Really, once they see signs that the English are going to invade, they all start to desert, don't they? That's going to happen in the rest of Act 5. But here we've got this extreme example of loyalty, where the waiting woman has actually asked the doctor to come in order to help the Queen, who must be a really good friend and, in her perspective, a really good woman. Well, how do we know that? Well, she's risking her life here, as you'll see later on in the scene. So there must be a real respect and love between her and Lady Macbeth, which just does not fit the idea of her as wholly evil. Now, to understand Lady Macbeth, we have to pay particular attention to what Shakespeare makes her do. And he intrigues us here because he gives us another letter. It's a letter that she's writing. Okay, well, the first thing you should notice here, which I haven't had pointed out to me before, this sleepwalking hasn't happened just because of guilt. It's only happened since His Majesty went into the field. That's the field of battle. So what's going on here isn't so much guilt as knowing that she is going to lose her crown. She's obviously going to lose her husband. She can see that they're going to be defeated. And it's not just guilt that's giving her these sleepless nights. I have seen her rise from her bed, throw her nightgown upon her, unlock her closet, take forth paper, fold it, write upon it, read it, afterwards seal it, and again return to bed. So what's in the letter? Well, here's the bit of genius that came from the student in my class. He said, what if that's the letter Macbeth sent? You know, right at the beginning of the play, with the witch's promises in it. And he introduced this idea. In her sleepwalking scene, what if she starts acting as Macbeth? In other words, when she asked to be unsexed and to be made into a man, what she wanted was to become a king. She wanted real power. And that's why she uses language in the play that emasculates her husband. And emasculates is a word that you're always going to be able to fit into any question on Macbeth, because you'll only really be asked about Macbeth himself, who is emasculated by his wife, or about Lady Macbeth and she emasculates him. And she does that by, well, there's several ways. She calls him a coward. She says, my hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white, again accusing him of cowardice and being feminine. And she even uses that feminine imagery, look like the innocent flower, you know, incredibly feminine description of him. And she talks about him being afraid all the time. So she truly attacks his masculinity here, his sense of bravery as a warrior, and undermines him. Well, one of the reasons for this is that she lives in a patriarchal society. No matter how brilliant she is as an individual, she can never achieve ultimate power, or perhaps even real power, because she's always, if you like, an extension of her husband. And that's the role of women in this society. And because she tries to break that role, this is what causes the break in her sanity, the schism in her sanity. And there is a further possibility that this class introduced. They said, well, yeah, this could be a suicide note, couldn't it? It doesn't have to be the letter that Macbeth wrote. It could be a suicide note explaining why she's killing herself. But also it might be a confession. So as we'll see later in the sleepwalking scene, she begins to confess what they've done. Why does she do that? Well, it could be a sign of her guilt, but at a deeper level, it might be that she wants Macbeth to get caught. In other words, she's punishing him for having abandoned her, for having taken power for himself and not given any to her. She blames him for having ruined this dream that she had of becoming queen with her husband at her side. And if we look back at the language he uses to justify keeping her away from his decisions, we can see that he says, be innocent So he pretends to want her not to be guilty, but actually she already is, isn't she? She's come up with the plan of killing Duncan. But what he's keeping her innocent from isn't actually guilt. He's keeping her innocent from knowledge. And as you know, knowledge is power. And this is actually a signal that it's the power of kingship that he is denying her. She's completely excluded from power. And then we've got this endearment here, which you might see as a sign of love. But Chuck is a little chicken. It's condescending, isn't it? My dearest Chuck, as though he no longer values her, certainly not as an equal partner in greatness, as he promised in the letter. And here is the evidence that the gentlewoman is risking her life. The doctor says, "What at any time have you heard her say? That, sir, which I will not report after her." So she'll tell the doctor so he can hear it for himself, but she won't put it into words, because if she does that, she can be held responsible for them, and Macbeth might have her executed. "You may to me, and it is most meet you should, so you really must do it. Neither to you nor anyone, having no witness to confirm my speech." So this is proof that the gentlewoman has invited the doctor to save the queen, to minister to her mind, even though what he might hear could damage her so much that she could be executed by Macbeth. Now, there's a really interesting description here of what Lady Macbeth does again. Once she finishes writing her letter, the doctor notices that she has a light, a taper, a candle, if you like, and she has a light by her continually. Now, this is obviously symbolic. Well, on one level, it's symbolic of her fear of hell. If you remember the dunnest smoke of hell that she summoned when she asked to be unsexed and asked those murdering ministers to tend on mortal thoughts to come and take away any sense of guilt. Well, actually, that hasn't worked. So she wants to get rid of the smoke of hell. So symbolically, she's now afraid of dying. She's afraid of what's going to happen, not to her, but to her soul. Remember, this is a Christian play. But if we look at that symbolism a little more closely, she's actually turned to God here. You know, light is symbolic of God. And so she's turning towards God, perhaps, pleading for help. And this is not something that the truly evil do. Now, far from executing her as an evil woman, Shakespeare spends a lot of time here trying to make us really empathize with her situation. So it is an accustomed action with her to seem thus washing her hands. This, of course, is symbolic of her trying to wash away the blood of killing Duncan. Remember, her hands were covered in blood because she took the knives that Macbeth had used to kill Duncan and took them back upstairs to frame the guards, the grooms, for having killed Duncan themselves. I have known her continue in this a quarter of an hour. That's an extremely long amount of time, and Shakespeare uses this to show quite how hard she's trying to overcome this guilt. And she's nearly succeeded, but there's just this spot left. Well, another way of looking at that is to say this contrasts with her husband. Her husband is the one who's truly evil, who's turned killing into a pastime, slaughtering Macduff's family. We can see here that Lady Macbeth is nothing like as evil as her husband. He is far more evil. And we're invited to sympathize with Lady Macbeth here. This next part of the scene is normally seen as proof of the guilt unsettling her mind to such an extent that she commits suicide. But actually, we can read that another way. It's not the guilt so much here, it's the lack of power that she has. So let's look at the repetition of the word spot. This is a symbol again of how little part she's had in the bloodletting. In other words, she's had such a little part in this relationship since Macbeth has become king. Uh, she is commanding out. This again is a symbol of power, this imperative verb which she repeats, out, out. And then she actually draws our attention to it. I say. So here, Shakespeare is pointing out how desperate she is for power, but that she does not have it. She cannot get rid of this spot of blood, and that is symbolic of the lack of power she has in everything else. And so this is why we get this strange bit of punctuation here, the two dashes, and this little quotation, which again, the student in my class interpreted in a way that I'd never seen done before. And what he said was this: 1, 2, why then 'tis time to do it. Well, who's counting the bells? It's not Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is ringing the bells. That's the signal to Macbeth, 2 bell rings, that the grooms have been drugged by her, that they're fast asleep, and he can go in undisturbed and execute King Duncan. So who's listening for the bell? Macbeth. So here, because she is powerless, she imagines herself as Macbeth, the person who has power. And she imagines herself as him because power is what she wants and what the patriarchal society has denied her. 1, 2, why then 'tis time to do it. Now, hell is murky is a comment we could take either way. It could be on her situation or Macbeth's. Now, fie, my lord, fie, a soldier and afeard. This disgust now isn't just a tactic to try and persuade him to kill Duncan. It's the full horror that her husband, who has all this power, is actually weaker than she is. And that's quite fascinating. This idea that she's actually the stronger of the two, but in the end kills herself not just through guilt, but because the gift of queenship, if you like, the gift of becoming queen, is worthless. She has no power at all. And this society has excluded her because it's a patriarchal society. And now her reminiscences, her memories, are tinged with irony. What need we fear who knows it? Well, now they should be afraid because the armies of Malcolm and England are advancing upon them, and they can see that they're outnumbered and defeat is imminent. But look at what she focused on: when none can call our power to account. And it's that power that she was so desperate to have. Again, proof that it's the lack of power that is causing this distress much more than the guilt. Yes, she clearly feels guilty here. Who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? But that is her second thought. The first thought is about how powerless she is, and how, in a way, Macbeth has robbed her of that power he promised. Lady Macbeth's next words also reveal her state of mind here. So the Thane of Fife, this is Macduff, had a wife, and the internal rhyme here reminds us of a child's nursery rhyme. So my student said, well, actually the real tragedy she's facing here is that she's tried to become queen as some kind of compensation for having lost a child. That first speech of hers to have her milk taken for gall is a complete rejection of motherhood. So having a child die has just been too much emotional pain for her, and she never wants to be a mother again and risk suffering that same pain. So this again makes us deeply sympathetic towards her. But the next part of her question, where is she now, again refers to her lack of power. And who has taken that power away? Macbeth. Macbeth has destroyed a wife, and it's no surprise that Lady Macbeth is fixating on this role of a wife, because obviously that is her role. And it's again a symbol of how the patriarchal society destroys women. Here, quite literally, it's had her killed. And this thought leads to Lady Macbeth choosing to take her own life. After this complaint about her lack of power, she does return to the sense of guilt. Here's the smell of blood still, and that metaphor of its smell shows us how deeply it's infected her. Visibly, there's only a spot, it's hardly noticeable, but the smell still lingers. She can't get rid of it. And that, of course, is a symbol, a metaphor of her guilt. But now her language becomes really feminine. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. She sees herself once more as a woman, but the focus on the word little also reminds us of what little power she has. The hand is a metaphor for the power that you hold, but here she has none. And her lament here, yes, it's about her guilt, not being able to get rid of that smell of her guilt, but it's also about that lack of power she has because of her husband's actions and because of the patriarchal society they live in. And then the final words that that Lady Macbeth has remind us how much better and different she is to Macbeth. Wash your hands, put on your nightgown, look not so pale. Now this was a description of when Duncan was killed, and the reason she keeps coming back to that is it's Duncan's murder that fills her with guilt. That's the only one that she's been involved with. But look at Macbeth. He couldn't care less about Duncan's murder. What's troubling Macbeth since they've killed Duncan is this. Banquo's buried. It's Banquo's ghost who appears to Macbeth. He's worried about killing his friend. Now, a modern audience might sympathise with this, but Shakespeare's audience would be appalled because what this says is that Macbeth has killed a king, has no regrets about that. His regrets are about killing Banquo. So just as the sleepwalking might symbolise Lady Macbeth's guilt, it's Banquo's ghost who symbolises Macbeth's guilt. He couldn't care less about having killed the king in order to become king himself. And that, in Shakespeare's time, is a far worse crime than that committed by Lady Macbeth. So we're invited to sympathise with her as far less evil than her husband. Now, if we look at the very final words that she utters, we can see again how much Shakespeare wants us to sympathise with her. To bed, there's knocking at the gate. There's a longing for bed here, which is a symbol of sleep. So on the one hand, death, she's longing for death, that links to her suicide, but she's also longing for peace and companionship. And it's interesting, isn't it, that when we started the scene, she's woken up, started wandering about. Macbeth's nowhere to be seen. And it's clear that Macbeth is no longer sleeping with her. This is a marriage that has broken down, and it's broken down because he has rejected her. Come, give me your hand. So this is remembering the time when Duncan was killed, but it's also a hand in marriage that she's desperate for. Again, it's that idea of partnership that Macbeth promised but has taken away. And then finally, what's done cannot be undone. She now realizes that, yes, she's giving advice to Macbeth not to worry about things, but for her, it's the opposite. She knows that the sin that she has committed can't be undone. She's going to go to hell. She can't get to heaven. And this is her tragedy. And that's also why she decides she might as well commit suicide, because, why wait? The compensation of life would have been one in which she achieved equality, one in which she achieved power, but that's been denied to her all the way through her queenship and Macbeth's kingship. And now, of course, she can see that it's going to be taken away with battle, which Macbeth is going to lose. And then finally, the repetition here of to bed, again shows us that longing for companionship with her husband, which he's rejected. And again, it's a metaphor for that sleep, the eternal sleep, for death. So to end, in this video, I've tried to convince you that It's the lack of power that Lady Macbeth has in this patriarchal society and in her marriage that is the primary driver, the main reason for her committing suicide, and guilt is the subsidiary, the lesser part of that desire to commit suicide. All the way through this video, I've tried to do one thing that the AQA exam likes, and it's this: compare the extract to the play as a whole. Hopefully you spotted that as we went through. If you didn't, replay it and revise. Thank you very much for watching, and if you'd like more, don't forget to subscribe.